I'm going to talk about this anthology that I edited and it's been published this year. It's called Animalia Indica. It's a collection of stories about animals from the Indian subcontinent, and I use stories broadly because it also has a poem and something by George Orwell, which we don't know whether it's a story or an essay, and I'll leave it at that. It seems slightly immodest to say that Animalia Indica is the first collection or anthology of its kind in India, at least in English India. So the suggestion for this book came from my editor at Aleph, David Davidar, who thought, because I had written about plant life in my first book, and he was aware that I was very fond of the non-human life, the plant and animal world, he asked me whether I would want to edit such a book. This was more than 2 years ago, and Davidar and my other editor, Ainla, helped me with looking at English language stories. But this has been a process of discovery for me, because I got to read many, many stories in translation from different linguistic cultures across India that I don't think I would have had access to had I not been translating, had I not edited this book. I will read and speak as I go on. This is what the book looks like. And, I have never said this before about any of my books, and I really don't consider this as my book because it belongs to the writers, the translators, and also the animals who are in it. The illustrations by Rohan in this book are absolutely outstanding. I mean, whether you read them for the stories or not, I think you would like to keep this as an as a piece of artwork in your homes. They're just amazing. So as I said, I'll read and explain, or maybe not explain, this is not a classroom, and talk about the book as I go on. As I write this, more a response than an introduction to a book of delightful stories by Indian writers about animals, I hear my 7-year-old nephew playing in the background. He wants to be an animal. Most of his games involve impersonations of his favorite animals. I'm tempted to join him and his friend in the game, and I do, unable to hold myself back after I hear him say, "Then you'll all fall down and die. All dinosaurs died like that, falling down." His friend attempts to mimic the imagined dinosaur. I come in and pretend to be another dinosaur, but am immediately shooed away. "You're a human, you can't play with us," he tells me. I want to ask my nephew what makes him want to imagine himself as an animal. It is a question I would have liked to ask Kafka and the storytellers of the Panchatantra and the Jataka tales. On the other side of language is the question I would have liked to ask those we call animals. Do they, the animals, ever play games or tell stories imagining themselves as humans? It is possible that only the human is aware of being human in a way that an insect or bat isn't. My nephew is not alone in his desire to become an animal, of course. Cinema, television shows, literature, video games, the automobile industry, all of these attest to man's subconscious desire to experience animal life, as if we were not animals at all. There's a bit of forgetfulness involved here, and a little bit of desire. A playfulness and curiosity that works both ways now. In animals being turned into residents of human spaces, of homes and zoos, as well as the human's imagined life as a hybrid, half human, half animal. I write all this sitting inside a plane. I am acutely aware of the animal-like ambition to be a bird temporarily. So many humans inside a bird. In a way there can't be in the zoological world. The aeroplane is modern man's Trojan horse, man becoming animal, that animal swallowing many, many men temporarily, only to disgorge them later. Animalia indica is the first anthology of its kind in the Indian subcontinent. While its ancestor might be seen to be the Panchatantra, with life and living illustrated through stories of animals, we are never allowed to forget that these animals are stand-ins for human prototypes. Morality is the axis of these ancient animal stories, common to almost all cultures across the world. So you have the Panchatantra here and the Aesop's fables there. The stories in Animalia Indica, written in the last 100 years or so, in English and translated from various Indian languages into English, make us aware of how far the modern Indian has come from the moral imagination of the anonymous storytellers and story collectors of the Panchatantra and the Jataka tales. Industrialization, journeys to the city, and the city itself led to the marginalization of animals from urban lives, not just physically, but also in the imagination. These stories by modern Indian writers about goats and cows, birds and dogs, horses and snakes, and various other animals give us unexpected pleasure in the discovery of a self within us of whose existence we are mostly unaware or even forgetful. When we think of ourselves as human most of the time and not as animal, that's what I mean. These stories also challenge the centrality of the human figure, an inheritance from the Renaissance that now controls our storytelling impulses. I just pause here to make clear what I mean. So what the European Renaissance as a movement did was it placed man at the center of the world. So if you see paintings and art from that time, you see sculptures, you see Michelangelo or Michelangelo, whichever way you pronounce it. When you see sculptures, these are sculptures of the human form. The human form is being celebrated. The human form is replacing the so-called divine or God, as it were. But what happens in the process is when Hamlet explains, oh, what a piece of art or what a work of art is man, the centrality of the human figure marginalizes every other kind of being. So what we now understand as the age of the Anthropocene, anthropo, as you know, is from anthropos, which has to do with us, with man. So we live in a highly anthropological world. So even here you will see that I'm sitting right in the center. If you think of this as the world, man is here. So all the paintings that we see, man is either at the center or man is, so we have the emergence of portrait paintings where this figure of study is the man. Very rarely do you have a filmmaker, and I feel happy mentioning this filmmaker because of his relationship with Pune. Very rarely do you find a filmmaker like Manikal, who lived here for so many years, or a painter and artist like Nandulal Bose, who, while drawing a painting, a scene of the picnic, leaves a blank canvas, and there right towards the margin are two human figures. And there's the river, the trees in motion, because when we think of a picnic, it's about our enjoyment. So these are very, I wouldn't say minor, but these are very rare instances of where we find a kind of equality that was there in the pre-modern age between man, animal, plant life, rivers, the air, all of these elements. These stories allow us to live like the best stories do. Live another life, becoming a lizard on a windowsill, an ant between toes, lice in hair, or zebras in zoos. So when we think of the lice, it only matters to us that the lice is harming our hair, is causing us disturbance. Not for a moment do we think of the life of the lice in the hair. It's always about us. So an anthropocentric view is basically a very self-centered view. A modern European imagined a human turning into an insect about 100 years ago. It changed Western literature and popular culture. Has something similar taken place here? I'm sure all of you get the reference I mean. I'm talking about Kafka's Metamorphosis. And I also find it interesting that while Kafka's Metamorphosis allows Gregor Samsa to metamorphose into something that is insect-like, and I got to know, I became aware of this world through my nephew and what he was watching on Cartoon Network. The fact of Spider-Man, half human, half animal. The figure of the werewolf. All these half human, half animal figures that have somehow come to animate the imagination of the modern man. So what this anthology of stories is basically trying to do, and that was our aim, is to compare how far, just as we have moved away from the quote-unquote natural world, how our stories have too. So while animals are there in these stories, sometimes they are marginalized. Sometimes they are the subject. But even in a Marathi story like Jamman, for instance, translated for this anthology by Shanta Gokhale, you will find what happens when a human or a human culture falls excessively in love with an animal form, as they do with the goat. You know, and there's a reason we call it the scapegoat. So, Balika Bakra. The Balika Bakra comes not only does not come from a place of hate, but the animal is substituting for the human here. So, therefore, Balika Bakra, in my stead, as it were. I think similarly, when you read this with the political climate, when you align this with the political climate of India today, the excessive protection given to the cow, immediately, I, for instance, have nothing against the cow, but I wish similar protection were given to all other animals. Why just the cow? Why not other animals? So when George Orwell says in Animal Farm, all animals are equal, but some are more equal than others, it's almost as if in some prescient way he's talking about the cow in 2019 India, as it were. So while reading these stories and thinking of Kafka and Spider-Man and all of these, I was asking myself, has something similar taken place here in modern India in the last 100 years? What is the Indian counterpart to the revolutionary act in European literature? Or to put it differently, how have Indian animals marked our literature? Do the animals in the Panchatantra and Aesop's fables behave similarly or in different ways in similar situations? It is possible that the birth of our nation, the invasion of technology, and the rise of individualism affected animals as much as they did humans. The Indian cow, to take the easiest example, is quite obviously not the same as the non-Indian cow. And the Indian elephant is not the same as an elephant from other parts of the world. As the scholar Rachel Dwyer reminds us, and I quote, early Europeans, by which she means the early Europeans who came to the Indian subcontinent, early Europeans found the animal gods of Hinduism the most distasteful. They were seen as quote unquote primitive or quote unquote low class or indigenous. In other words, she continues to write, these deities were seen as too worldly compared to the more abstract classical deities. Yet, other deities are also animals or part animal, and the Jatakas, part animal, including the avatars of Vishnu, Hanuman, and many mythical creatures. And the Jatakas tell the stories of the Buddha's incarnations in various animal forms. I am tempted to believe that these aren't just stories by Indian writers about animals. These are stories by Indian writers about Indian animals. Our time is up? Okay. Want to have a Q&A? Okay. I would have liked to read 2 short paragraphs from 2 of these stories, but I'm sure she's right to remind me that we should have a Q&A. 2 points I wanted to emphasize, I'll just mention this in passing now, is a question that I get asked often is, what are the things I noticed while editing this collection? One is the sound of animals. You will remember that the stories of the Panchatantra and the Jataka come to us as human voices. The animals speak in a human language. When I was reading these stories, I encountered the voices of these animals as onomatopoeia, which is a figure of speech where we try to mimic sound. So you have shy shy, chit chat, that kind of sound that we as socialized city dwellers hear. So I think at one point of time there was a similarity in language. I don't mean linguistic cultures, but a similarity in language spaces that the human and the pre-modern man shared. The pre-modern man and the animal shared. And therefore it was easy for the pre-modern man to imagine that the animal would naturally therefore speak in a way the way we spoke. Now that disjunction is very evident. We are aware of not being animals. So we abuse, all our abuses, whether you are calling someone a pig or a dog, whatever it is, come from there because we have imagined and decided that these are inferior than us. These creatures are inferior than us. The other point I wanted to make is about death. When I was proofreading these stories, it didn't occur to me before that most of these animals die in these stories. And animals die in the Jataka tales and the Panchatantra and the Aesop's fables too. But you'll realize that death there comes as some kind of retribution and has to do with morality. You do something wrong, you're punished. You die. That is how the animal world worked in these stories. But in this case, the animals die because of us. Because of what one animal, that is the human, has done to other animals. So if you have any questions, maybe, yes.
Yeah, so actually you made a very big canvas of art, as you stated about Michelangelo and the Renaissance era, and so I want to draw this, that Da Vinci painted the Vitruvian Man. Okay, and then we moved forward. Then you told us about Kafka, and you told us about Hanuman also. So don't you think at that point also, at the Renaissance era, there were people who were trying to figure out what animals felt or what they were feeling at that moment, but they didn't get enough recognition as compared to, because even Pablo in the La Belle Epoque, he painted the bull's head, okay, with a handle of a cycle. And so as moving forward, right now we have this, all of your stories we have where we are considering about Spider-Man or any creature. So do you think we are much more being acceptable right now about that particular thing as we consider animals also in our community? Or was it not at that time, but it was not much appreciated or not much, considered? What are your thoughts on that?
That's a nice question. See, what the moderns tried to do, by here I don't only mean modernism but modernity, what the moderns tried to do, and again I think of the romantics, the British romantics and the European romantics as being the first moderns. So because I'm assuming you come from a literature background? Yeah. So you will remember that in the preface to Lyrical Ballads, Wordsworth says that the language that he wants to use is, and I quote, the language that the common man doth use. It was a revolutionary book. It was a revolutionary book not only because it was published in 1798, 9 years after 1789 and the French Revolution, because what Wordsworth and Coleridge did was they created the first democracy in that literary text. Before that, we only had literature about kings. Hamlet, King Lear, Othello, and the Prince of Denmark, all of that. So here we have about, even Blake did that. He's writing about the marginalized, mad people. You know what I'm getting to. What the moderns did, because we're talking about Kafka, the moderns, after the romantics, and they picked it up from there, and by moderns I only do not mean the British moderns, but also the modernist cultures all across the world. What they did was they decided that no one was big or small enough to be held inside a book. So we could have not King Lear, but Mrs. Dalloway. The fact that it could be about ordinary people such as you and myself. So we have the animal gradually coming back. One of the sad things, reviews of this book have been coming, and in one review, and I find it hilarious, my friend Kunal is here, he will laugh if he knows this. One of the reviewers said, "Oh, I was very excited about this book and I began reading it and blah blah, and I was disappointed that these were only stories about animals." I'm sorry, but animals don't write yet. If they could, we would have a truly modernist literature in that sense. I think our time is, okay, sorry.
I wanted to ask, is talking animals just the purview of kids literature, or is there a possibility to explore adult themes also within the purview of talking animals?
That's a brilliant question. Thank you. In the introduction, I say that these are not stories for animals, but these are not stories for adults either. I mean, a child, he would respond differently to a dog, and you would respond differently. Similarly, the way you relate to these stories would be different. This, I want to believe, that this distinction that we have created is such an artificial distinction between children's literature and adults' literature. This did not exist during the time when the oral imagination of the Panchatantra and the Jataka tales were created. I would like to think so. Yeah.
One small question. What originally was the target audience for this book?
They're actually, are you a publisher?
No. I'm just a reader. I just wanted to know what was it, when it was designed.
It was made, so my editor David Davidar was very clear that it would not be a children's book. Yeah, but I was also very clear that I wanted a book which children could go to. I mean, Robinson Crusoe, it came to us abridged in Radiant Reader when we were in class 4 or class 6. And it was the first novel written in the English language, and we have to study it at university. So we did not make this distinction. Similarly, I think that my nephew would be able to enjoy these stories as much as you and I would be able to enjoy them. How old is she? Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for coming to a session about animals. There aren't any animals here, so it's a good time to think of ourselves as animals, therefore. Thank you.